Hey everybody, Aaron Mac BS Detective. Excuse my face. I went a little crazy with the makeup today. I don't know. I was just bored. Anyways, what is happening? There's dogs just coming in and out of the room. This is why I shouldn't leave the door cracked. My dog is perpetually stressed out. She's got Cushing's disease, and I try to, give her stuff to like chill her out. I've got her on a diet, but she paces kind of back and forth. And so she wanted to go out of the room because she usually hates it when I sit here and read. She wants to go out. She doesn't want to hear my voice. So I let her out, but I left it cracked just in case, because then she'll start scratching on the door if she wants to come back in. And then I have to stop and get up and deal with that. So I was like, screw it. I'm just gonna leave the door cracked. And of course, then the little dog comes down and weasels her way in. And now the big dog is like, oh no, you're not going in there without me. That's my territory. So then she busts through the door. I don't know what's going on. Anyways, today, look at this stupid face of this stupid flocker. Okay? And this book has to do with chronic fatigue syndrome, which my mom was actually diagnosed with that before they diagnosed her with multiple sclerosis back in the 90s. And I do remember chronic fatigue. Sorry, I'm getting rid of these glasses. It's not like I need them to see to read this book. But I do remember chronic fatigue syndrome. I remember drug commercials. I remember medications. I remember. So this is the introduction to this book that is somehow connected to Fauci and chronic fatigue and HIV, which he was very much behind. He was very much behind the medications of using the cancer drugs that literally didn't work on the cancer patients. They just basically unalived people. I had a friend in the late 90s. I was very much a party girl back in the day, and Atlanta has a huge gay scene, and I always felt safer around the gay guys because they, didn't hit on me or anything. I mean, sometimes even some of them did, but most of them left me alone, and they were just fun to party with. So that's who I partied with. Well, my across the street neighbor and dear friend, he was diagnosed, quote unquote, with HIV, and then my downstairs neighbor was as well. But we know now that literally the PCR test is the test that is used for any quote unquote virus, which I don't even believe exists. Given that I think germ theory is just that, a theory, and a bullshit one at that, kind of like gravity. So anyways, I'm going to just read this introduction to this little book. I haven't decided what to do next as far as what we're going to read or whatever. So with all this crap going on with Fauci, I just figured, hey, let's just do a little palate cleanse and read this short little book. Maybe it might take me 2 recordings, but all right, this is the introduction. This little book consists of a chapter about Anthony Fauci from, quote, The Chronic Fatigue Epidemic Cover-Up, Volume 2. It includes a new afterword. Holy crap. So this is a part of a book that has volumes. Wow. If justice and truth prevail in the world, one day, what has been called, quote, AIDS will be renamed, quote, Schmolocaust 2, end quote. While gay people were secondary victims of what is referred to as, quote, the Schmolocaust or Schmolocaust 1, they were the main attraction in Schmolocaust 2, and that's facts. I did a research paper when I was in college about how hepatitis C has a patent number, and they were using gay guys, party guys in New York City back in, I don't remember if it was the 70s or early 80s, to poison people, basically, because now that's what I realized they did. And with Fauci and his quote gain of research facility, gain of function, okay, literally means they're trying to make it, whatever it is, whatever poison that they have, they're trying to make it contagious. That is what gain of function means. They are giving something that is inert, not contagious, not bad for you at all. They're trying to take it, make it alive, and make it contagious. Give it gain of function. Does that make sense? So this piece of shit, he's going to have a lot to answer for one day. And this is why I'm so pissed, because the one friend that I had that took the medications, every medicine that the doctors gave him, okay, it was like AZT and all that shit. He died in like 2001. And then the other neighbor, the downstairs neighbor, he was like, whatever, bro, I'm not listening to y'all. And he is still alive and kicking. And I think he's like even undetectable because they use the polymerase chain reaction or PCR test to test for that. And if you really have looked into HIV, you would know that like standards across countries are not the same. They're not standardized. You could stand with 1 foot in Canada and 1 foot in America and be HIV positive in one country and HIV negative in the other, because all they're testing for is proteins. So in like America, I think you have to have the presence of like, I don't know, maybe 3. And in Canada, you have to have the presence of 4. And then in the UK, I think you even have to have the presence of like 5 of the proteins to even be considered positive. So it's not a very scientific mode of testing. Why Carrie Mullis won a Nobel Prize for it, I do not know. I feel like what they're doing is rewarding people who come up with like evil scientist, like mad scientist tools to brainwash the public with into believing that like, oh my gosh, you're positive for this thing that's literally just testing for a protein. A protein is not a virus. And yeah, they try to like say, well, this one is associated my ass. It's based on bullshit, a house of cards. It's nonsense. That's why the whole corona apocalypse thing was bullshit. And an Alberta court, Canada court ruled that it doesn't even exist. Because back during the corona apocalypse, in Canada was so like authoritarian with it. You could be ticketed if you weren't wearing a mask walking down the street. Okay. So what happened was this guy gets a ticket and he's like, no, absolutely not. I'm not paying it. It was like $125 or something. So he takes it literally to court, all the way to the highest court in the land. Okay. And Alberta, Canada Supreme Court ruled in his favor because they asked the CDC for an isolate of it to prove that it actually exists. And they didn't do that. They couldn't do it. So what are we even fucking talking about? Right? So, the heterosexist motivation of their stigmatism and persecution in both Holocausts were even similar, even if the manner in which they were harmed was different. I have used the term iatrogenocide to describe what happened to gay men and others during the Holocaust too, and that is facts, bro. Google the word iatrogenics or Google iatrogenics. That is the 3rd leading cause of death in the Western world. I'm pretty much definitely, I'm sure that it's definitely in the US. I don't know if it's like UK and like Australia. But iatrogenics is the 3rd leading cause of death, like behind heart disease and like, I don't know, diabetes or something like that. And you know what iatrogenic means? Harm caused by doctors. That's what that means. So, but yeah, and then of course, they're going to use the people that are on the fringes of society to test all their stuff because nobody's going to have a sympathy for a bunch of gay guys, you know? It's just this whole... it's touched everything, okay? It has touched everything. Anyways. So, I was a witness to the, quote, AIDS epidemic from the very beginning. As the publisher and editor-in-chief of New York Native, I inadvertently oversaw the reporting of the very first story about the epidemic. After hearing about a strange pneumonia occurring in gay men in New York City, I asked a physician to make inquiries with the public health authorities. In a story headlined, quote, disease rumors largely unfounded, end quote, published in our May 18th, 1981 issue, Dr. Lawrence Mass wrote, quote, last week, there were rumors that an exotic new disease had hit the gay community in New York. Here are the facts. From the New York City Department of Health, Dr. Steve Phillips explained that the rumors are for the most part unfounded. Each year, approximately 12 to 24 cases of infection with a protozoa-type organism, Pneumocystis carinii, are reported in the New York City area. The organism is not exotic. In fact, it's ubiquitous. but most of us have a natural or easily acquired immunity. 6 weeks later, it turned out that the rumors were true when the CDC reported on the first cases, what would be called AIDS. It is hard to overstate the shock and terror that gripped the gay community in New York City and eventually around the world. And mind you, this was after they had done all this crap with hepatitis C, because they did the same thing with the gays in New York. And I think it might have actually been around this same time. Maybe it was a decade before. I'm not sure. Maybe it was like the early 70s. I'd have to go back and look it up. But when I was in television production school, I had to write a paper about like I think we could pick whatever topic. And I've always been obsessed kind of with gnarly diseases. Like, and when I was in high school, I was obsessed with the Ebola virus that I know now is just, the evil shitlords poisoning people pretty much. Okay, so people dreaded waking up each morning as bad news just got worse and worse. Given that my paper seemed to be at the ground zero of the event, I made the conscious decision to devote New York Native to covering every detail of the story. For the first 2 years, our coverage was so thorough that some people started referring to my newspaper as the New York Native Journal of Medicine, end quote. Many of our readers and advertisers resented our coverage and wanted us to focus on positive stories. But I felt that we had a responsibility to get to the bottom of what was going on, as do I. Because the truth actually matters to some people. I know it's very shocking, but it does. I mean, some people can just, shrug it off and go on about their life, but shit like this bothers me immensely. I want to know what is happening, Anyways, as the cases mounted and the gay community began to accept the reality of the epidemic, our coverage began to be appreciated, and the New York Native became a trusted source for the latest news about AIDS. In the April 25th, 1985 issue of Rolling Stone, David Black said that the New York Native deserved a Pulitzer Prize for our reporting. Hold on 1 second. Okay, I had to close the door. All the upstairs shenanigans you're starting to be able to hear that down here. Anyways, okay, where was I? Okay. Rolling Stone, David Black said that the New York Native deserved a Pulitzer Prize for our reporting. In his best-selling book, And the Band Played On, Randy Schultz wrote, quote, because of extraordinary reporting of the New York Native, the city's gay community had been exposed to far more information about AIDS than San Francisco in 1981 and 1982, end quote. And in the March 23rd, 1989 Rolling Stone, Katie Leishman wrote, quote, it is undeniable that many major AIDS stories were Ortlieb's months and sometimes years before mainstream journalists took them up. Ortlieb's. Is that who wrote this? Yeah, okay, Ortlieb. Charles Ortlieb is the guy that wrote this. Anyways, okay. As I have detailed in my history of New York Native, the chronic fatigue syndrome epidemic cover-up, as the epidemic went on and our reporting became more investigative, I began to notice serious credibility gaps in what the CDC was telling the public about the AIDS epidemic. Doesn't that sound kind of familiar? I remember posting legit CDC links on my Facebook 4 and 5 years ago, telling people this is the BS they have on their own website, but we're continuing to listen to and believe them. And Facebook would literally take it down and call it misinformation. And I simply would share a link and maybe a one sentence, sometimes one word about the article or the link to the CDC. And my stuff would get taken down. I was getting put in Facebook jail all the time. Finally, that account was hacked and I don't have it anymore, which is very unfortunate because I had 5,000 followers on that one, almost 5,000 followers on that one. And then my backup one also got because the hackers, So now I have hardly anyone on my Facebook. Plus, I don't think anybody's really paying attention to Facebook anymore. I know that's a very Gen X boomer coded app. And I know a lot of the kids are on Instagram, but Instagram's just not my thing. And I honestly don't think that, I don't know. I feel like it's kind of harder to relate. Maybe, I don't know. And then, you know, some of the kids at work are like, what's your Instagram? I'm like, I don't have one. Because like, I don't want people to think I'm crazy and I have no idea literally even what's on my Instagram. Like, I haven't looked at it, curated it, or anything. So it could be anything on there. But I know it's probably got an anti-Zionist slant to it. Definitely. Anyways. Okay, so as the epidemic went on and on, our reporting became more investigative. I began to notice serious credibility gaps from the CDC. What they were telling the public about the AIDS epidemic. AIDS increasingly reminded me of the period of egregious government mendacity that occurred during the Vietnam era. As the government began to build a paradigm around the notion that AIDS was caused by a retrovirus, ultimately labeled, quote, HIV, end quote, I watched as credible critics of the retroviral theory. Okay, these are fucking theories. Credible critics of the retroviral theory were silenced and vilified. I discussed the heroic voices that spoke out and Peter Duesberg and the Duesbergians. About that, I tried to get the invention, I think it was called the invention of inventing the AIDS virus, something like that. It was written by Duesberg. He's the one that like literally exposed the whole thing. I think he even injected himself with the quote unquote AIDS needle on national television to prove to everyone that it was fucking bullshit. And yet still to this day, people like want to believe it's real. It's crazy to me. Like I had a couple of, at one of my last bars, I had a gay couple. They were married and they were really cute boys. I loved them. They were really sweet. And quote, one was diagnosed with HIV and the other one was fine. And this kid is taking this medication thinking that it's going to help protect him from passing quote unquote HIV or whatever to his husband. And I'm like, bro, it's not how any of this works. It's nuts. It's truly nuts what's going on. Anyways. My newspaper became even more controversial. Anyways, hold on. Let me say this. So when I tried to tell them, hey, good news, that shit's not real, dude. Y'all, you don't have to worry, bro. They almost got upset. They got upset and they didn't want to hear the truth or the facts that you can find in books. You know, the news is not going to tell you this, people. It's not going to tell you. It is not going to fucking tell you what's really going on at all. So this, you know, nomenclature of like, and parlance of mainstream media and academia, it's all bullshit. Say it with me. It's all bullshit. Like it's literally, that's all it is. And that's what I do on this channel. I detect bullshit. And I know you're like, but Aaron, based on just this little book that you're saying so, you know, it's like, okay. It is a lifestyle thing, all right? That is why you get sick. And that applies across the board to anybody. I smoke and I vape. You know, it shouldn't be surprising. And I don't want to like put a curse on myself or anything. But this is why we get sick. Because we do stupid shit like this, okay? I shouldn't have to tell people how biology works. But like, your poop chute is an exit-only device, okay? You start ramming fecal matter, which is what causes disease, really. I think that's probably the cause of the bubonic plague. I don't think it was like a virus from fleas and rats or whatever the fuck they said. They had very bad sanitation back then. Everybody was filthy. Shit is filthy. Okay? Like it or not, this is not a moral judgment on anyone. This is just a statement of fact, okay? And so you take that and then the party scene that was going on at that time, those poppers, they were the things that were causing the Kaposi sarcoma. Because all of them did the poppers. That's where that came from. You cannot inhale certain inhalants and like that are toxic and expect not to get some form of cancer or something. I mean, it's like, come on, bro. Let's use our common sense, okay? All these hoogity boogity germs and like shit you can catch, none of it's real, okay? So like, stop living in fear. It's all good. You're not going to die, all right? But clean up your diet, try not to smoke, try not to drink, try not to do things that are poisonous and bad for you, which, I mean, I guess probably rubbers might help a little bit. I don't know with that situation. But nevertheless, okay, let's get back to the book. As AIDS activists, hold on. My newspaper became even more controversial when we began reporting on another epidemic called chronic fatigue syndrome. From our extensive reporting, it was hard not to conclude that chronic fatigue syndrome is part of the AIDS epidemic and is linked to AIDS by a virus called HHV6, which I call bullshit on that, which government scientists refuse to take seriously. Because my mother does not have AIDS, and she was, quote unquote, diagnosed with chronic fatigue, I think they deployed some sort of electronic something around that time. And we will see this book right here, The Invisible Rainbow. We're going to get to that because that factors in with all of this. All the advents, with each advent of every new technology of electricity, wireless, all of that, there's been a wave of illness that has hit the world. CV-19 being the last one with the 5G rollout, okay? That you could overlay the 5G hotspots on the map with the map of the emergence of, quote, the coronavirus, and they match exactly. And I saw this in 2020 when it was happening, okay? And this is what's hard, is I have all this information up here and I want to get it out to people, but people want you to like quote chapter and verse and provide a link and all this shit. And I don't have all that stuff. Like, and I know, trust me, bro, is not a good explanation, but I'm telling you, I saw this with my own two eyes, and I can't remember. I think I was on my tablet. I remember I had broken my ankle. Okay. So I was like heavy online. That was when the whole event 201 thing was going on from the World Economic Forum. They were doing like a drill. And that's another thing. Anytime there's a drill, whether it be locally or globally, and the quote media is there, whether they tell you it's fake or real, because a lot of like these school shootings over here, they're running a drill at the same time. And it's like the news just happens to be there already. So a lot of these people are crisis actors. And if you don't know what a crisis actor is, Google it. They're hiring them. I'm telling you right now, for more psyops to come on Craigslist as we speak. Andrew Breitbart called that shit out, and he's unalived now. Okay? So, anyways, as AIDS activists increasingly lined up behind the government's HIV/AIDS paradigm and draconian public health agenda, the inconvenient truths my newspaper was reporting about HHV6 and chronic fatigue syndrome became increasingly unpopular. Nobody wanted to believe that the elite AIDS doctors and scientists might have gotten AIDS totally wrong. ACT UP, New York's powerful AIDS activist group, voted to boycott New York Native, and they did anything they could to put us out of business. Finally, in January 1997, we published our final issue. In the last 20 years, I've given a great deal of thought to the nature of what happened to my newspaper and to the integrity of AIDS science and medicine. A number of my thoughts on the subject are collected in Iatrogenocide, Notes for a Political Philosophy of Epidemiology and Science. And that's one book, friends, we're probably going to have to get, because that is another realm of bullshit that everybody needs to wake up and realize is fucking you, and it's fake. I mean, yeah, sure, they can do great stuff for like trauma, okay? Like if you break your femur, they can patch you back together. But a lot of this proactive, get your labs done, all this shit is bullshit. And that is why we have people misdiagnosed with cancer all the time. Parasites, guys. Parasites are a huge reason why we get sick. I'm just saying, allegedly. All right. Anyways, I have also written a play about the politics of the epidemic called the Black Party. My thoughts about the racial politics of AIDS can be found in a novella, The Closing Argument. I have come to the conclusion that the similarities between AIDS science and Nazi science are too obvious for people of conscience to ignore. Is this not starting to make you think for a second because literally this is being brought up in a book that supposedly has nothing to do with the past 3 books that I've read, and yet here we are still talking about it, still talking about them. In this groundbreaking book about Nazi treatment of Jays, Life Unworthy of Life, Racial Phobia and Mass Murder in Hitler's Germany, which I'm sure is a fucking book full of tripe and bullshit. I mean, I'm sure some people were treated bad, but like, bro, 6 million, come on. Let's be for real. Anyways, let me be quiet about that. James M. Glass writes, quote, "It was not cultural propagandists who organized the infamous special treatment of the Jays. It was the public health officials, the scientific journals, the physicians, the administrators, and the lawyers who feared the very presence of the Jays would endanger their families, their bodies, and ultimately their lives." Well, and let me stop for a minute and like remind you as to why, because I've already read 3 books about this, all right? It's because of what the Jays, the double crossing that they did to the Germans, okay? The economic bullshit that they did to the Germans, the weird sex shit, okay? They had like a trans museum in the fucking 1930s in Germany. What do you mean, bro? Like every stinking, rotten fucking thing seemed to come. They'd also drained the wealth of Germany and then totally fucked them over after. Like talked the United States into joining the Second World War. I mean, like crazy town. Okay, so we don't have to believe everything that we read. We can think for ourselves. To think of the J in such terms is insane from our perspective. Oh, is it? I don't think it's that insane, but whatever. But it was held to be sane, and the culture caught up in the phobic projection of infection to the Jays and the scientific authority legitimizing such beliefs. End quote. Okay, no, that's not what it was at all. Okay, that the Jays were subverting German culture. They were draining them economically, financially, and morally. Okay, so let's cut the fucking shit right there. That's where that bullshit is going to stop on this channel. Anyways. Okay, in many ways, AIDS, or what I call the Holocaust too, involved what could be called special epidemiological treatment, end quote, of the gays, which was created and supported by health officials, scientific journals, physicians, administrators, lawyers, activists, celebrities, and understood by public health authorities, and the general public is assumed to be sane. A closer look reveals that genocidal insanity lurks beneath the surface. That's facts. But to act like, oh, it was some Nazi idea. Bro, have we seen communism? Fascism is not really an opposite to communism. It's kind of like very similar in that they're both authoritarian regimes. You know what I mean? The economics might be a little bit more, which means under communism, more people are going to starve to fucking death. But like the practices, the authoritarian practices of the heads of academia, medicine, etc., the leaders, the thought leaders, are the ones that make all the decisions, and the plebs are just left to fucking deal with the deadly insanity that ensues when such bullshit is allowed to run rampant. Okay, so while the manner in which AIDS is understood by public health authorities and the general public is assumed to be sane, a closer look reveals that a genocidal insanity lurks beneath the surface. And that is for all medicine. Okay? It's not just having to do with gays. It's having to do with everybody. But there are like special target demographics that are easier to pull this shit with. Okay? Because the enemy comes to what? Steal, kill, and destroy. Okay, so it's a playbook. This playbook has been used over and over and over, and they're going to continue to do it. All right? Wake up to the game being played on you. Okay. In the case of AIDS, a fraudulent and phobic epidemiology has been used to scapegoat and biomedically persecute the gay community and many others. And that's facts. And I feel like the same thing is also kind of happening with the Jays a little bit, because I think ultimately it's the Jesuits that are behind pushing this whole fake biblical narrative of it being the end times and, this whole Zionism. It's like without the Jesuits, the Jays would not be able to do anything that they're doing right now. Okay. They're being allowed to run this fucking bullshit. It's all secret society bullshit, guys. Okay. In this chapter from the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Epidemic Cover-Up, Volume 2, I discuss the scientist I consider to be among the important architects of Holocaust 2. He played a key role in creating the kind of science which I describe in iatrogenocide as being abnormal, totalitarian, and sociopathic. Yes. I believe that when honest and brave scientists finally give Fauci's AIDS and chronic fatigue syndrome work the due diligence it deserves, they will recognize that he has essentially been running a scientific Ponzi scheme for decades. Science now has its own Bernie Madoff, and it's been had it for a very long time. I don't think people understand, like Fauci was legit behind the whole AIDS thing, okay? So him being like an evil shitlord of medicine is nothing new, all right? Chronic fatigue syndrome and the HIV Ponzi scheme. That's chapter 1. November 2nd, 1984 was an especially tragic day in the chronic fatigue syndrome / AIDS epidemic. And to me, this is news to me, okay? I haven't read this book. Like, I literally saw it on Amazon or something. It was like $7, and I was like, yeah, I'll take it. Because, like, all this crap that was going on with him, and I knew he was an evil shitlord. I know he wants to depopulate the world. I know what I've got eyes to see. Thank you, Jesus. But I had no idea that he had anything to do with the chronic fatigue syndrome. I had no idea that chronic fatigue was actually linked to HIV/AIDS. I had no idea. Like I said, my mother has got multiple sclerosis. So she was diagnosed with chronic fatigue like back in like 95 or something. Like I was still in high school. So, but I find it very insane that like they're grouping it together and calling it a chronic fatigue syndrome / AIDS epidemic. Like that's crazy. That was the day Anthony Fauci became the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID. Good Intentions, page 128, I guess, would be the chapter that he's pulling this from his own book that he's written. It was the day a thin-skinned, physically ultra-diminutive man with a legendary Napoleonic attitude was positioned by destiny to become the de facto AIDS czar. In the fog of culpability that it constitutes what could be called the Schmolocaust 2, like I'm afraid to even say that word because I don't want anything to get taken down. One thing is clear. The buck, on its way to the very top of the government, at least pauses at the megalomaniac desk of Anthony Fauci. Lord, sometimes words. In his book, Good Intentions, Bruce Nussbaum writes, quote, Fauci looked as if he had just stepped out of a limousine. Trim and athletic, Fauci's tailored suits, cuff-link shirts, and aviator glasses set him far apart from the rest of the scientists and administrators at the NIH, end quote. Fauci had risen quickly at NIH. According to Nussbaum, he began working at NIH in 1968 after his residency, and by, quote, 1977, he was deputy clinical director of NIAID, end quote. Nussbaum describes Fauci as, quote, an aggressive administrator, end quote, not a details man, end quote, a big picture kind of guy. Nussbaum reports that, quote, Fauci saw AIDS as a dreadful disease and an opportunity for NIAID to grow into a much bigger, more powerful institute. AIDS was his big chance. He wasn't known as a brilliant scientist, and he had little background in managing a big bureaucracy, but Fauci did have ambition and drive to spare. This lackluster scientist was about to find his true vocation, empire building, end quote. Unfortunately, the empire his extreme ambition would build was a, quote, Holocaust too, end quote. If the mantra during Watergate was, quote, follow the money, end quote, the mantra for uncovering the crimes of Schmolocaust too, end quote, other than follow the heterosexism, end quote, could be, quote, follow the empire building, end quote. And one of the morals of the story is that lackluster can have an extreme consequence. According to Nussbaum, in order to make his dreams come true, Fauci had to fight, quote, for a bigger piece of the AIDS research pie, end quote, which he succeeded at by getting a sizable amount of the funds that Congress had appropriated for AIDS research. Fauci also had to fight to get AIDS out of the claws of the National Cancer Institute, where the virus that was believed to be the cause of AIDS had been discovered, or more accurately, stolen. Fauci argued that it was his institute's right to take on the lion's share of the research because although AIDS did involve cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, which I mentioned earlier, which was from like the poppers and the huffing of drugs and stuff that will totally wreck your immune system and cause you to die. Okay. Drugs have always been bad and they've always been poison. And so, I mean, come on. It was, after all, an infectious disease. I don't really think it was an infectious disease. I mean, they try to make it sound like infectious disease, like it's catching or something. Like, no, bro. It can be, you can be poisoned. Okay. It could be deadly poison. All right. Let's see. It was, after all, an infectious. Okay, Fauci got his way, and his success is reflected in the evolving financial numbers Nussbaum provides. Quote, a growing budget for AIDS research like a rising tide lifted Tony Fauci's profile considerably on the NIH campus. In 1982, NIAID received $297,000 in AIDS funding. In 1986, it received $63 million. In 1987, the sum reached $146 million. By 1990, NIAID's annual AIDS funding was pushing $500 million. Tony Fauci's ship had come in, end quote. Yeah, this motherfucker has been getting rich off of unaliving people for decades. I mean, he's Satan. Fauci's ship coming in meant the gay communities would be sinking fast. And that's true. Do you know how many people, like my friend that was killed by the drugs that he was told to take, that he was led to believe would help save him? He died literally almost 3 decades before my other friend, who is still alive and kicking and living life to this day. So that is fucking tragic, and it's a crime. It's literally a crime. My friend was poisoned to death, and that is what happened. Okay. It would fall to Anthony Fauci to be the enforcer-in-chief of the homodemiological HIV, AIDS, and chronic fatigue syndrome is not AIDS paradigms of Schmolikoff II. No one can argue that he didn't do a spectacular job of paradigm enforcement for 3 dreadful decades. Starting in the mid-1980s, an organization called the American Foundation for AIDS Research, or AMFAR, played a multifaceted role of raising money for HIV research and enlisting celebrities in a glamorous and ultimately shameful HIV propaganda campaign that made the putatively private organization essentially a de facto arm of the government's HIV/AIDS establishment. If one considers the HIV theory of AIDS a Potemkin biomedical village that gays were forced to live in, then the AMFAR is one of its leading real estate agents. John Lauritsen, in his book, quote, The AIDS War, writes that AMFAR was founded as an alternative to the AIDS establishment to provide funding for research that was not predicated on the, quote, AIDS virus hypothesis. It didn't last long. I'm not aware that even a penny has ever been given to a researcher who publicly expressed doubts as to the etiological role of HIV or the benefits of the nucleoside analogs, end quote. And I think those are the medications that were so deadly and dangerous that killed a lot of people. In addition to becoming one of the leading private promoters of the government's HIV/AIDS paradigm propaganda, AMFAR played a distributing role in squelching serious scientific criticism of the AIDS HIV hypothesis and in helping turn the entire field of AIDS into a world of heterosexist, totalitarian, and abnormal science. Lauritsen describes an historically important AMFAR moment in the AIDS disaster in his first book, Poison by Prescription. Quote, a scientific forum on the etiology of AIDS sponsored by the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR, was held on 9th April 1988 at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. In the words of the AMFAR fact sheet, the forum was convened to critically examine the evidence that human immunodeficiency virus or other agents give rise to the disease complex known as AIDS, end quote. According to Lauritsen, it was supposedly an opportunity for Peter Duesberg, the University of California at Berkeley retrovirologist who first challenged the HIV theory of AIDS, quote, to confront members of the AIDS establishment over their hypothesis, end quote. And I remember watching that on TV, bro. I remember that. And there's still videos. I mean, probably not on here because like anything else on YouTube, if it's facts, if it's truth, it's been removed. So there's that. BitChute probably still has it. Anyways. Okay. He reports, however, that despite these praiseworthy intentions, the forum appears to have a hidden agenda to discredit Duesberg. Lauritsen characterized the forum as a kangaroo court. The forum would make a great scene in a play about the nasty, zany world of AIDS and HIV pseudoscience. It was anything but an honest, open, collegial discussion about the nature of AIDS. Scientific philosopher Thomas Kuhn would roll over in his grave if anyone called it genuinely scientific. By Kuhn's standards, some of the leading voices at the forum may have even demonstrated that they should not have even been considered real scientists. Politicians, yes. Scientists, not so much. Even the HIV theory's ardent acolyte, Michael Spector, the reporter from the Washington Post and future New Yorker writer, who was among the 17 journalists at the forum, saw through the charade, noting that the meeting was, quote, was billed as a scientific forum on the cause of AIDS, but really an attempt to put Duesberg's theories to rest, end quote. It was more like they wanted to put Duesberg himself permanently to rest. The meeting had the tone and style that was endemic to HIV/AIDS research and the characteristic of abnormal and totalitarian science. Lauritsen reported that, quote, while no blows were struck, some of the HIV protagonists fell below the standards of civility that are expected in scholarly debate. At all times, Duesberg retained good manners and a sense of humor in the face of invective, insults, and clowning from his opponents, end quote. One of the signs that AIDS in general was being conducted on the opposite world of what could be called abnormal totalitarian science was the uncanny willingness of the science to abandon the traditional rules of evidence known as Koch's postulates. Okay? That is a very, I mean, they even use that as a standard, and that I can remember in when I was looking into flat earth, they made an appeal to Koch's postulates because it is a very base level standard for scientific inquiry. All right. Anyways, the meeting, okay. Instead, AIDS researchers, included the one at the AMFAR forum, were willing to, quote, revise Koch's in a more permissive direction. It would no longer be necessary to find the microbe in all cases of the disease. Mere correlations between microbial antibodies and the progression of the disease would be sufficient. Isn't that interesting? HIV could be proved epidemiologically to be the cause of AIDS, end quote. Given the unrecognized sexual politics of the science that was operative among this crowd, they were basically saying, without realizing it, that causation could be established, quote, homodemiologically, end quote. The presumptions of heterosexist and political epidemiology would trump the traditional rules of evidence, and those rules would basically be summed up as, quote, heads I win and tails you lose, end quote. You basically being gays and eventually blacks, and eventually all of us. But like I said, they always pick the little guy. I mean, they're always picking on the little guy, okay? So any demographic that is smaller than just generally white people, okay, in America is obviously going to be targeted, bro. Anybody. Lauritsen caught the powerful HIV advocates in the act of doublespeak that is common to abnormal totalitarian science. Quote, actually, the HIV advocates talked out of both sides of their mouths with regard to Koch's postulates. On the one hand, they disparaged them as in need of modification. Read abandonment. On the other hand, they were doing their best to come up with data that would satisfy at least the first postulate, end quote. Duesberg's opponents at the forum included a living, breathing example of scientific conflict of interest, William Hazeltine, a scientist who was in the process of making a lot of money from HIV testing, and Anthony Fauci, the empire-building director of NIAID. At the AMFAR forum, Fauci and others, excuse me, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. But I've been reading for 45 minutes. I'm not going to stop. At the Amphar Forum, Fauci and others played a curious, unfair game with Duesberg. Hypocritically, they accused Duesberg of citing research that was out of date, given though it was basically the same research quoted at that time by the AIDS establishment. On the other hand, when Duesberg would ask Fauci and others for actual references to support their statements at the Amphar Forum, he was, quote, rudely rebuffed, end quote. And according to Lauritsen, they tried to shore up their viewpoint about HIV with unpublished data or their own private facts, or alternative facts, as we call them today. Quote, private facts not on the public record are another sign that AIDS was a manifestation of the opposite world of abnormal, totalitarian, and sociopathic science. Unfortunately, their private facts about AIDS were also connected to each other by a private scientific logic. And I don't guess this is going to probably even have any chapters to it. So, should I read for an hour and then try to read for another hour and be done with it? I guess we'll keep going. The 800-pound gorilla at the Amphar Forum was the fact that evidence of HIV could not be found in all AIDS patients, which should have been strong, damning even evidence that HIV couldn't possibly be the cause of AIDS. That is, if Kuhnian normal science was being practiced. As scientist Marcel Baluta pointed out at that meeting, quote, sometimes even a single exception is sufficient to disprove a theory, end quote. This is the crux of the matter. The virus cannot be found in all of cases of AIDS, end quote. One could say that still believing that HIV is the cause of AIDS in the face of evidence that it could not be found in all patients is exhibit A, that delusion and denial were running the show. And a lot of times it does, dude. It does. I mean, like, I couldn't believe how many brainwashed people during the whole coronavirus, I mean, everybody was living in fear. Everyone was like scared shitless out of their minds and willing to do whatever they were told. And clearly, these kind of fucking people are mad scientists. Don't listen to them. Do not put anything into your body that they're selling. Don't do it. Fauci's answer belongs in a beginner's textbook on the card tricks of abnormal science. Quote, Fauci responded to Baluta by saying that a good lab was able to isolate the virus in 90 to 100% of cases, that there was, quote, no question about it. Fauci did not provide a reference to published data, nor did he indicate that what the good labs were, or how exactly they differed from the not so good labs, end quote. References belong to the abandoned Kuhnian world of normal science. Duesberg made a number of arguments based on his years as one of the celebrated deans of retroviral research about why HIV could not possibly be the cause of AIDS. Lauritsen wrote that Fauci's presentation, quote, while aspiring to be a point-by-point rebuttal to Duesberg, consisted mainly of disconnected assertions delivered in a tone of petulant indignation. Epidemiological studies conducted in San Francisco and unpublished laboratory reports seemed to be the basis of most of his statements. So far as I could tell, he understood none of Duesberg's arguments, end quote. Yeah, because he's a fucking idiot. He is a hired hand. He is sold out to the evil shitlords that run this place, this prison planet that we're on. And so he's been doing the devil's work. The role of the AIDS politics of epidemiology and AIDS research showed itself dramatically at the forum. According to Lauritsen, quote, in the question period, Baluta asked if the evidence was sufficient that HIV is necessary for the development of AIDS. Fauci replied that he hoped the epidemiologist would answer that question, end quote. Given the political and heterosexist nature of AIDS epidemiology, one could guess how that was going to turn out. The most shocking and downright hilarious episode at the forum occurred when Harvard Medical School's William Hazeltine spoke. Lauritsen reported that, quote, his presentation was devoted largely to personal attacks on Duesberg, end quote. Ironically, he accused Duesberg of resorting to personal attacks. And doesn't that sound familiar? The projection and the accusing the other of what you're doing. It sounds really familiar to me. In another telltale moment of abnormal and totalitarian science, Lauritsen caught Hazeltine trying to explain away the anomalies about the evidence of AIDS in men and women in America. Quote, He attacked Duisberg's paradox that the AIDS virus seemed to be able to discriminate between boys and girls by saying that this was not true outside the U.S. In Africa, about equal numbers of men and women develop AIDS. He seemed oblivious to the paradox that a microbe should be able to discriminate in one country but not another. Like I said, with the testing of AIDS or HIV, okay? In a memorable moment that perfectly captured the essence of the past and future of AIDS research, Hazeltine showed the audience a slide of a graph that was meant to absolutely demolish Duisberg's argument. The slide was supposed to show a correlation between the rise in HIV titers with the decline of T cells and the progression of AIDS. There was just one small problem. Duisberg quickly noticed that there were no units on the vertical axis of the slide. Hazeltine was angry and flustered by the charge and had to ask Dr. Robert Redfield, an AIDS researcher from the military, how the slide was prepared. At the forum, Redfield said, quote, different measurements were used, end quote. But later that night at a post-forum party, according to Lauritson's report, Redfield told Duisberg and other people at the gathering that, quote, the graph had been prepared to illustrate a theoretical possibility. It had no units on it for the simple reason that it was not based on any data at all. In other words, the slide was a fake, end quote. That's the kind of ideology-based data that was used to back up the HIV theory of AIDS, which changed the course of millions of lives and fostered the HHV-6 catastrophe. In terms of the habitual use of political epidemiology or homodemiology, rather than real science to deal with AIDS during the Schmolocast II, end quote, the most disturbing talk was given by Warren Winkelstein, professor of biomedical environmental health sciences at UC Berkeley. Essentially, he too suggested that AIDS would require a new kind of science. According to Lauritsen, quote, the point of Winkelstein's presentation is that Koch's postulates should be superseded by new standards for establishing the causal relationship between microbes and disease, and that these standards should be based upon epidemiology, or as it were, correlations of various kinds, end quote. If this crowd had superseded traditional science any more than they did, we all would have probably been dead. But wait, there's still time. Yeah, they're still playing this fucking game, bro. And it's not science, okay? It's made up fuckery to get you to poison yourself. Stop listening to doctors. They don't know what they're talking about, okay? Most of the scientific world was not aware, allegedly, most of the scientific world was not aware of the degree to which this zany cast of characters was improvising a questionable, newfangled science as they went along. And it was being done in a Fauci style of petulant indignation, to reprise Lauritsen's very apt phrase, that it was all dependent on a loosey-goosey, all too subjective political discipline like epidemiology, should have disturbed Lauritsen's 16 journalistic colleagues who were at the Amphar affair. But there was already a tragically cozy relationship between the media and the abnormal, totalitarian, and sociopathic scientists of Schmolocast II, end quote. For 3 decades, as HIV/AIDS paradigm held sway, most of the reporters who covered up AIDS were a self-satisfied, inattentive, group-thinking, intellectually slothful bunch who wouldn't know independent journalistic due diligence if it bit them. A corrupt scientific community could totally depend on them, for sure. We cannot trust the media any longer. They are owned by these same evil shitlords, okay? It's all one big fucking group of people. Lauritsen's eyewitness record of the forum, originally published in New York Native, was an important contribution to the history of the flaky beginnings of the science and totalitarian politics of AIDS. His diligent and critical reporting is proof that not every journalist was hoodwinked by these charlatans. He didn't buy into this new improvised epidemiological science that the AIDS establishment was dumping on the public. Quote, I do not accept the proposition that Koch's postulates should be abandoned in favor of epidemiological correlations. This would be a step backward, a step away from scientific rigor, a step towards impressionism and confusion, end quote. Lauritsen didn't acknowledge it, but it was also a big heterosexist and ultimately racist step backwards. Like many others, Lauritsen came face to face with totalitarian, abnormal, and sociopathic science. Unfortunately, even though he was openly gay himself, he didn't grasp the manner in which the infernal game was being played, or what the game was actually concealing. And that is the problem, is a lot of people don't see it, even when they're right in the middle of it. Because you guys are giving people the benefit of the doubt. Stop. Stop giving these people the benefit of the doubt. And by these people, I mean these evil shitlords, these mad scientists, these corrupt politicians, all of them. Stop giving them the benefit of the doubt. They do not have your best interest in mind. They are sold out to money and they've sold out to the evil shitlords. Everyone is controlled by money today, okay? All right. He didn't grasp the manner in which the infernal game was being played or what the game was actually concealing. He didn't fully perceive the homodemiological underpinnings of what was happening before his very eyes. But he definitely grasped the fact that science of the budding AIDS establishment was utterly bogus. He concluded his report by writing, quote, I am more convinced than ever that HIV is not the cause of AIDS. If the HIV advocates were sure of their hypothesis, they would want to enlighten Duisberg and the rest of us. They would want to publish their arguments in a proper scientific journal, complete with references. They would not need to resort to stonewalling, deception, and personal abuse. End quote. Science had been supplanted by totalitarian petulance. The 1988 Amfar Forum was another one of the tragic what-if moments in the dark history of AIDS. What if the reporters had looked closer at Hazeltine's fake slide and realized that it was a tip of the iceberg, a little like the scientific version of the Watergate break-in that would have led them to a much bigger crime if only they followed the lies? What if they had reported that AIDS science, as practiced by Anthony Fauci, was simply out to lunch? What if they had been independent enough to notice that epidemiology was overplaying its arrogant, biased hand and that in reality it is actually a soft, subjective enterprise vulnerable to political manipulation? Why was it beyond the pale to wonder if this defensive and cranky gathering was actually the expression of some rather unsavory feelings and hostilities directed at the so-called beneficiaries of this new kind of science, namely the gay community? Maybe someone should have asked if there was something funky about a group of hostile, arrogant, white, heterosexual, mostly male scientists performing their jerry-built kind of seat-of-the-pants epidemiological science on gays. Which now when I hear white, hetero, whatever, it makes me just think, because everything blamed on the white people is actually done by the Jays, all right? It's concocted, conceived, boiled up, put together, and financed by the Jays, okay? But just kind of like the Jays are kind of playing the sacrificial lamb or whatever of the bigger Jesuit end of the world scenario that they're trying to run. You know, it trickles down. Shit's rolling downhill here. So, in turn, the Jesuits are blaming the Jays. Now, everybody's looking at Israel, which what they're doing is not cool, should not be allowed. They're committing a shmenocide. That's facts. They're not even who they claim to be, all right? So they're fucking over their own citizens. They're lying to them. Then it's trickling down to these other people, this Fauci person. Who is he? Who's he being funded by? Like, this shit is, it's fucked. It's totally fucked, bro. It's a big club and we're not in it, friends. And we've got to wake up before they literally kill us all. Why was it beyond the pale to wonder if this defensive and cranky gathering was actually an expression of some rather unsavory feelings and the hostilities directed at the so-called beneficiaries of this new kind of science, namely the gay community? Maybe someone should have asked if there was something funky about a group of hostile, arrogant, white, heterosexually male scientists performing their jerry-built kind of seat-of-the-pants epidemiological science on gays. Wasn't that a formula for all kinds of prurient, heterosexist, pseudoscientific mischief, if there ever was one? In terms of majorities doing their science on minorities, hadn't anyone ever heard of Schnazi science or the Tuskegee syphilis experiment? God only knows what personal sexual issues were being acted out by this elite motley crew under the cover of what has turned out to be a highfalutin retroviral claptrap. And at that, I think I'm going to stop and just leave it here and then pick it up and finish reading. Love you guys.